This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome to today's exploration of military strategy and tactics. In this narration, we'll delve into the concept of Russian bastion defense, a defensive doctrine that transforms fortified positions into formidable strongholds capable of withstanding sustained attacks. We'll examine how this approach combines defensive depth, interlocking fields of fire, and strategic positioning to create nearly impenetrable defensive networks. Whether you're a military history enthusiast, a strategy game player, or simply curious about defensive warfare, you'll discover the principles that have made bastion defense a cornerstone of Russian military thinking. Let's begin our journey into the art of defensive warfare. Chapter 1. The Bastion Doctrine. A bastion in traditional military architecture is a projecting portion of a fortification that eliminates the blind spots beneath castle walls, enabling defenders to protect the vulnerable areas where attackers might otherwise mass undetected. Though physical bastions became obsolete with the advent of tanks and aircraft, the concept endures in modern military strategy, particularly in Russia's approach to defending its most critical naval assets. Today, Russia's bastion defense represents not a stone fortress, but a vast maritime zone in the Arctic where ballistic missile submarines operate under the protective umbrella of layered defenses stretching across air, surface, and sub-sea domains. The contemporary Russian bastion finds its roots in a crisis of vulnerability that emerged during the Cold War. In the late 1960s and through the 1980s, intelligence flowed both ways across the Iron Curtain. The spy ring led by United States Navy Warrant Officer John Walker, operating from 1967 to 1985, systematically compromised American cryptographic systems, while Soviet intelligence channels revealed growing Western anti-submarine warfare capabilities. Soviet military planners discovered that their submarines, despite representing the seaborne leg of the nuclear triad, faced significant detection risks when operating in open ocean. American anti-submarine warfare capabilities, including the sound surveillance system known as SOSUS, formed underwater listening arrays across strategic choke points like the gap between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom. These arrays could detect the acoustic signatures of Soviet submarines attempting to transit into the Atlantic Ocean, where they might threaten American coastal cities or interdict reinforcement convoys crossing from North America to Europe. Faced with this vulnerability, Soviet naval strategists made a fundamental decision that would shape their maritime doctrine for decades. Rather than attempting to achieve submarine superiority across the world's oceans, they would concentrate their ballistic missile submarines in heavily defended waters close to Soviet territory. The Barents Sea, adjacent to the Kola Peninsula in Russia's northwest, became the primary bastion for the Northern Fleet. Meanwhile, the Sea of Okhotsk in the Far East served the same function for the Pacific Fleet. Within these protected zones, submarines carrying nuclear-tipped missiles could patrol with relative safety. Shielded by approximately 75% of the Soviet Navy's attack submarines, every major surface combatant in the regional fleet, and hundreds of aircraft dedicated to anti-submarine warfare and air defense. This concentration of defensive power transformed specific bodies of water into fortified maritime zones. The Barents Sea offered acoustic advantages for submarine operations beyond just its relatively shallow depth. The seafloor topology and the mixing of Arctic and Atlantic waters created acoustic layers that complicated enemy sonar detection, allowing submarines to hide beneath these layers or use the variable sound propagation to mask their movements. Submarines operating from bases around Murmansk and the Kola Peninsula needed to travel only short distances to reach patrol areas where their missiles could strike targets across North America and Europe. This proximity to home waters meant shorter, safer transits and longer periods on station, maintaining the constant alert posture required for credible nuclear deterrence. The strategic logic extended beyond the inner bastion itself. Soviet planners recognized that protecting the submarines required controlling not just the Bering Sea, but also the approaches through which NATO forces might attempt to penetrate the defensive perimeter. The gap between North Cape on the Norwegian mainland and Bear Island became a critical defensive line. Soviet forces needed the capability to detect, track, and if necessary, engage any hostile ships or submarines attempting to pass through this relatively narrow passage into the Barents Sea proper. Further out, the Soviet Navy developed capabilities to contest control of the Norwegian Sea and potentially to threaten NATO operations as far west as the Greenland-Iceland-United Kingdom gap, the strategic choke point through which all transatlantic reinforcement and resupply would need to flow in the event of war in Europe. This outer defensive layer represented not full sea control, but rather sea denial, the ability to impose costs and create risks that might deter NATO forces from attempting operations in these waters. Western understanding of this Soviet strategy emerged gradually through careful analysis of publicly available Soviet military writings. Between 1972 and 73, Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, the Soviet Navy's commander-in-chief, published a series of 11 articles in the naval journal Morskoy Zbornik under the headline Navies in War and Peace. These articles, dense with historical analysis and theoretical discussion, represented an unprecedented window into Soviet naval thinking. American and Allied analysts parsed these texts with extraordinary care, attempting to divine the operational concepts underlying Gorshkov's occasionally opaque prose. Robert Herrick, Robert Wineland, Bradford Dismukes, and particularly James McConnell emerged as key interpreters of Soviet doctrine. McConnell's September 1974 analysis, a 45-page examination of Soviet naval strategy, proved foundational to Western understanding. From this painstaking analysis emerged the Western construct of the bastion defense concept. Yet it bears emphasizing a critical point often overlooked. Soviet and later Russian military documents have never confirmed this terminology. The bastion concept remained entirely a Western interpretation, inferred from observable force deployments and doctrinal hints rather than confirmed through explicit Russian statements. This distinction matters because it reveals how Western analysts constructed a framework for understanding Russian strategy that may or may not align with how Russian planners themselves conceptualized their maritime defense. The framework that emerged from this analysis rested on three foundational assumptions about Soviet and later Russian naval strategy. First, Russia's geographic disadvantages make submarine operations close to home waters strategically favorable. Russia's coastline, though extensive, faces severe constraints. The Northern Fleet's exit routes to the Atlantic pass through narrow gaps easily monitored by NATO sensors. The Pacific Fleet faces similar challenges transiting between the Sea of Okhotsk and the open Pacific. The Black Sea Fleet operates in an enclosed sea with access controlled by Turkish straits. Given these geographic realities, attempting to disperse ballistic missile submarines globally would expose them to unacceptable risks during transit through monitored choke points. Concentrating them in defended home waters exploited Russia's advantages in land-based air power and coastal defenses, while minimizing exposure to enemy anti-submarine forces. Second, the primary mission of Russia's ballistic missile submarines is ensuring second strike or even third strike nuclear capability. Unlike first strike weapons that might be used in a surprise attack, second strike forces must survive an enemy's initial attack and retain the ability to retaliate with devastating effect. This survivability requirement drives the entire bastion concept. Even if enemy strikes destroyed Russia's land-based missile silos and strategic bomber bases, submarines on patrol in defended bastions would remain largely intact, hidden beneath Arctic waters and protected by multiple defensive layers. The certainty that these submarines would survive to launch their missiles forms the bedrock of nuclear deterrence, convincing potential adversaries that any first strike would inevitably lead to their own destruction in return. Third, the primary wartime mission of Russia's conventional naval forces, the attack submarines, surface combatants, maritime patrol aircraft, and coastal defense systems, is ensuring the survival of those ballistic missile submarines. Every frigate patrolling the Barents Sea, every fighter jet stationed at Arctic bases, every coastal missile battery positioned along the Kola Peninsula exists principally to create the defensive bubble within which the strategic submarines can operate safely. This represents a fundamentally different naval strategy from that pursued by maritime powers like the United States or the United Kingdom, whose navies focus on achieving sea control across vast ocean areas to protect global trade routes and project power ashore. Russia's navy, particularly in its northern theater, exists primarily to deny access rather than to control sea lanes, to defend a specific zone rather than to dominate the maritime commons. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 might have signaled the end of bastion defense. Throughout the 1990s, Russia's navy fell into severe decline. Submarines rusted at pierside due to lack of maintenance funding. Skilled sailors and officers left service for more lucrative civilian employment. Submarine cruises dropped from 80 per year in 1985 to just 18 by 1995, while surface vessel operations fell from 125 cruises to 45 in the same period. The Barents Sea seemed less a fortified bastion than an open-air maritime museum of decaying Soviet military power. Yet the bastion concept never truly died. Key figures within Russia's defense establishment, particularly Andrei Kokoshin, who served as first deputy defense minister from 1992 to 97, maintained that a strategic bastion in the north remained essential to Russian security even in the post-Cold War era. Kokoshin authored a classified concept document arguing that without a functioning bastion defense, Russia's sea-based nuclear deterrent would become vulnerable to American attack. The protection of ballistic missile submarines, he argued, required not just the submarines themselves, but the entire supporting infrastructure of bases, air defenses, attack submarines, and surface combatants that made the Barents Sea a survivable operating area. Though Russia lacked the resources in the 1990s to fully maintain this architecture, the conceptual framework remained intact, waiting for economic recovery and political will to revive it. That revival began in earnest during Vladimir Putin's presidency, particularly after his speech in Murmansk in 2007, where he signaled renewed Russian prioritization of Arctic interests. Putin personally identifies with Arctic conquest as a distinctive feature of Russian nationalism, drawing on historical narratives of Russian exploration and Stalin's Red Arctic propaganda. For Putin, the Arctic represents not merely a strategic military space, but a demonstration of Russia's return to great power status. The region's vast energy resources, oil and natural gas deposits that become increasingly accessible as climate change reduces ice coverage, provide economic rationale for increased attention. The Northern Sea Route, potentially navigable year-round within decades, could become a vital commercial waterway under Russian control. But beneath these economic considerations lies the enduring military imperative, protecting the submarines that carry Russia's most secure retaliatory nuclear strike capability. Climate change introduces a profound paradox into bastion defense calculations. As Arctic ice recedes, opening new shipping routes and extending the navigation season along the Northern Sea Route, Russia faces contradictory pressures. The opening Arctic creates economic opportunities and potentially allows year-round access to resources and trade routes that were previously locked behind ice for much of the year. Yet reduced ice coverage simultaneously makes the region more accessible to potential adversaries, eliminates natural barriers that once complicated surface and air operations, and potentially exposes Russian submarines to greater detection risk from sensors that would have been blocked by ice. The Bastion strategy must adapt to an Arctic that is less isolated, more commercially active, and militarily more accessible than at any time since Russia began deploying ballistic missile submarines there. Russia gains commercial access but loses the defensive advantages that ice once provided, forcing a recalculation of how to maintain the Bastion's integrity in an environment transformed by warming temperatures. The evolution from pure defense to a hybrid strategy combining defensive core and offensive outer layer reflects this adaptation. The inner bastion, centered on the Barents Sea, remains focused on protecting ballistic missile submarines through concentrated defenses. But the outer defensive layer has expanded its mission beyond simple protection, developing capabilities to threaten NATO forces across the Norwegian Sea and potentially as far west as the Greenland-Iceland-United Kingdom gap. This sea denial capability serves both to push potential threats farther from the inner bastion and to impose costs on NATO operations, forcing alliance planners to allocate resources to suppressing Russian capabilities before conducting other missions in the region. The distinction between the defensive inner core and the offensive outer layer reveals how the Bastion concept has matured from pure sanctuary into a more sophisticated strategy that leverages defensive advantages while creating offensive dilemmas for adversaries. The practical implementation of this doctrine, the specific forces Russia has organized to execute Bastion defense, and the command structures that integrate air, surface, and subsurface elements into a unified defensive system reveal whether the elegant strategic logic translates into operational reality capable of protecting Russia's most vital military assets against sophisticated Western threats in an Arctic environment that grows more contested with each passing year. Chapter 2. The Northern Fleet's Nuclear Mission at Severomorsk, a closed military city on the Kola Peninsula, the operations center of Russia's Northern Fleet, displays a map that reveals the force's strategic primacy. Unlike other Russian fleet commands confined to regional theaters, the Northern Fleet's area of responsibility extends across the Arctic Ocean and into the Atlantic, encompassing waters where Russia's ballistic missile submarines conduct the patrols that underpin the nation's nuclear deterrent. This reality was formally acknowledged in December 2015 when the Northern Fleet was elevated to a unified strategic command, a designation placing it equal to Russia's military districts and recognizing its unique integration of naval, air, and ground forces under a single commander responsible for defending Russia's most critical military mission. Admiral Alexander Moiseyev, who assumed leadership as Commander-in-Chief of the Russian Navy in late 2024, oversees from Severomorsk not just warships, but an integrated force including the 45th Air Force and Air Defense Army. This unified command structure reflects Russian recognition that protecting ballistic missile submarines requires seamless coordination across domains. A submarine captain maneuvering beneath the Barents Sea needs to know precisely where friendly fighters patrol overhead, where surface combatants screen approaches, and when coastal defense exercises might complicate his transit routes. The Kola Peninsula provides the physical foundation for this defensive architecture. At Gajivo, approximately 60 kilometers from Murmansk along a winding Arctic highway, the 31st Submarine Division commands Russia's most modern ballistic missile submarines, the Borei and Borei A-class vessels designated as Project 955 and 955A. The base facilities include protected submarine pens carved into coastal rock, maintenance workshops capable of servicing nuclear reactors, and living quarters for submariners and their families who endure isolation and climate extremes that would defeat personnel from more temperate regions. Nuclear weapons demand specialized handling that occurs at Okolnaya Bay, a restricted zone where missile handling infrastructure allows loading submarine-launched ballistic missiles onto boats. The missiles themselves, whether the liquid-fueled Saniva used on older Delta IV submarines or the solid-fueled Bulava carried by Borei-class boats, arrive from manufacturing facilities in central Russia via secure rail transport. Specialized cranes transfer missiles weighing dozens of tons from rail cars into protective silos aboard submarines. Each missile contains highly volatile propellants or solid fuel matrices that could detonate if mishandled.
Operations conducted in temperatures reaching -40°C with Arctic winds howling across the bay testify to the professionalism of personnel maintaining Russia's nuclear arsenal under conditions that would paralyze forces trained for conventional theaters.
From Gajievo, a Borei-class submarine preparing for patrol undergoes final checks of reactor, weapon systems, navigation equipment, and communications gear. When the submarine departs, it passes through waters that become progressively colder and darker, moving north into the Barents Sea. Transit time to patrol areas typically runs 12 to 24 hours at operational speed. Russian doctrine envisions maintaining 1 to 3 submarines on patrol at any given time, a rotation allowing some boats to undergo maintenance while others conduct training or stand in ready reserve. This patrol pattern differs markedly from American operations, where the U.S. Navy aims to keep a higher percentage of its ballistic missile submarine fleet at sea continuously. Russian submarines operating from Gajievo reach patrol stations in under a day, their missiles ranging targets across North America and Europe from positions within 500 to 1,000 kilometers of home port. American submarines based in Washington State or Georgia must transit thousands of miles to reach patrol stations, burning through crew endurance and mechanical reliability merely getting to where deterrence patrols can begin. Russia's geographic advantage allows shorter rotations while maintaining credible deterrence, though the concentrated basing also creates vulnerability should adversaries develop capability to neutralize the Kola Peninsula installations.
Once on station, the submarine's mission becomes survival through invisibility. Unlike attack submarines actively hunting enemy vessels, a ballistic missile submarine seeks to become undetectable, maintaining communications only through sporadic, extremely low-frequency transmissions from shore-based antennas. The boat operates at depths and speeds calculated to minimize noise. Crew routines emphasize silence. Machinery operates at reduced power. Movement through passageways is minimized during sensitive periods. And even galley meal preparation times avoid equipment noise during hours when enemy surveillance might be most active. Protecting these submarines requires complex arrangements of screening forces operating across multiple domains. Russia's Yasen-class attack submarines form the underwater outer perimeter. These boats, designated Project 885 Yasen and the improved Project 885M Yasen-M, carry torpedoes, anti-ship cruise missiles, and land attack cruise missiles, making them formidable opponents for NATO submarines attempting to penetrate the Barents Sea. The Kazan, Novosibirsk, and Krasnoyarsk represent the cutting edge of Russian submarine technology, incorporating pump jet propulsion for reduced acoustic signatures, advanced sonar arrays, and sophisticated combat systems. Surface combatants provide visible defensive layers, patrolling approaches, and conducting anti-submarine warfare using sonar systems and helicopters equipped with dipping sonar and sonobuoys. The Admiral Gorshkov-class frigates pack considerable offensive and defensive capability into hulls of less than 5,000 tons displacement. Each carries 16 vertical launch cells for Kaliber cruise missiles or Onyx anti-ship missiles, Parliament Redut air defense systems, torpedoes, and anti-submarine rocket systems. The Udaloy-class destroyers, legacy vessels from the Soviet era but progressively modernized, specialize in anti-submarine warfare with helicopters, rocket-propelled depth charges, and torpedo tubes. Aviation extends the defensive perimeter far beyond surface ship reach. Tu-142 maritime patrol aircraft, derived from the Tu-95 strategic bomber but optimized for hunting submarines, conduct long-range missions over the Barents Sea and into the Norwegian Sea. These massive four-engine turboprops carry sonar buoys, magnetic anomaly detectors, and torpedoes, allowing them to detect and prosecute submarine contacts hundreds of kilometers from their base. IL-38 maritime patrol aircraft provide similar capability in a smaller, more economical package. When an IL-38 patrol aircraft detects a submarine contact, the data flows instantly to Northern Fleet headquarters at Severomorsk through secure communications links. Analysts there correlate the contact with other intelligence, perhaps a signal intercept indicating foreign submarine communications, or a radar track from a coastal station showing an unusual surface vessel in the vicinity. The headquarters issues updated guidance to an Admiral Gorshkov frigate operating nearby, directing it to investigate while maintaining vigilance for additional threats. The frigate's Ka-27 helicopter launches, proceeds to the contact area, and deploys dipping sonar and sonobuoys to refine the submarine's location. Meanwhile, a Yasen-class attack submarine maneuvering submerged in the same area receives encrypted communications directing it to reposition toward the contact. This orchestrated response exemplifies how the Northern Fleet attempts to achieve synergy across domains. The Barents Sea surface poses challenges extending beyond military operations. Ice, though diminishing due to climate change, still forms across portions of the sea during winter months. Submarine operations beneath ice require specialized skills and equipment, including upward-looking sonar that maps the ice canopy and allows submarines to find polynyas, areas of open water or thin ice where boats might surface in emergency. Russia has perfected the technique of under-ice launches, allowing ballistic missile submarines to fire weapons even when trapped beneath solid ice coverage.
Modernization of SEVER Omarovsk-1 airbase illustrates how infrastructure investments support the broader deterrent mission. This facility, built during the Soviet era but extensively refurbished beginning in the mid-2010s, now serves as a command and control center for Arctic military operations. Hardened command bunkers, protected by reinforced concrete and designed to survive near-miss nuclear explosions, house communications equipment linking the Northern Fleet to Moscow's National Command Authority. Redundant communication systems ensure that even if conventional links are severed, extremely low-frequency transmitters can still broadcast authentication codes to submarines, confirming that launch orders come from legitimate authority rather than enemy deception. Ground forces also contribute to bastion defense, though their missions differ from traditional Army operations. Arctic motorized brigades stationed on the Kola Peninsula train for conditions that would incapacitate forces from temperate regions. While these brigades might seem peripheral to naval operations, they secure land-based infrastructure upon which the Northern Fleet depends. Air bases, radar stations, missile storage facilities, and communications nodes all require physical security against special operations raids or sabotage attempts.
Operational tempo in the Northern Fleet has increased markedly since the mid-2010s. Submarine patrols have recovered significantly from their post-Soviet decline, though they remain below Cold War peaks. Surface combatant operations similarly show renewed activity, with Admiral Gorshkov frigates and modernized Udaloy destroyers conducting exercises in the Barents Sea, Norwegian Sea, and even venturing into the Atlantic during Show the Flag deployments. Aviation sorties by maritime patrol aircraft and fighters have surged, with NATO reporting regular interceptions of Russian aircraft probing along the Norwegian coast and near Iceland. Yet maintaining this readiness imposes costs measured in rubles and in wear on equipment and personnel. The harsh Arctic environment accelerates corrosion, strains mechanical systems, and demands frequent maintenance that depletes budgets and occupies shipyard capacity. Sailors and officers enduring months aboard submarines or surface ships in Arctic waters face psychological stresses affecting retention and morale. Russia's demographic decline means fewer young men available for military service, forcing the Northern Fleet to compete with other commands for the most qualified recruits. The Northern Fleet must also balance its primary mission of protecting ballistic missile submarines against other demands. Russia's national leadership expects the fleet to conduct power projection operations having nothing to do with bastion defense, deploying to Syria to support operations there, showing the flag in the Mediterranean or off the coast of Africa, or demonstrating that Russia remains a global naval power. Each mission diverts assets, consumes operational hours on ship systems, and places wear on vessels that must then undergo maintenance before returning to their primary deterrent role. The tension between strategic missions and operational commitments reflects a broader challenge facing Russian military planners: sustaining great power ambitions with finite resources while ensuring that the submarines carrying Russia's most secure retaliatory strike capability can operate with impunity in waters where their survival guarantees that any attack on Russia would meet devastating response. Chapter 3: Arctic Infrastructure and Military Reach. The transformation of Russia's Arctic military posture extends far beyond the concentrated might of the Northern Fleet on the Kola Peninsula. Across thousands of kilometers of coastline, from the Norwegian border in the west to the Bering Strait in the east, Russia has constructed a network of bases, radar stations, and defensive positions that convert remote islands and coastal outposts into nodes of military power. This archipelago of installations serves multiple purposes simultaneously: monitoring air and maritime approaches, supporting operations along the northern sea route, providing search and rescue capability, and creating the infrastructure necessary for Russia to project sovereignty over territories so isolated that continuous human presence would otherwise be economically unjustifiable. The scale of this infrastructure program becomes apparent when considering that Russia reopened more than 50 military installations abandoned during the chaos of the 1990s, including 13 airbases, 10 radar stations, 20 border outposts, and 10 integrated emergency rescue stations. The collapse of Soviet power had left Arctic bases to decay, their personnel withdrawn, equipment cannibalized for parts, and buildings exposed to the crushing cycle of Arctic freeze and thaw. Hangars collapsed under snow loads, runways fractured from frost heave, and coastal erosion claimed facilities built too close to shorelines. Following renewed Russian Arctic prioritization in the late 2000s, the infrastructure program required not merely renovating structures, but rebuilding entire logistics chains, capable of sustaining year-round operations in locations accessible only by air or by ship during brief summer navigation windows. Alexandra Land, part of the Franz Josef Land archipelago, exemplifies this transformation. Located at 80 degrees north latitude, roughly 950 kilometers from the North Pole, the island hosts the Nagorskoye Air Base, sometimes called the Arctic Trefoil for its distinctive three-lobed architectural design. Construction crews working in conditions where temperatures routinely plunge below -40 Celsius erected a complex painted in blue, red, and white camouflage that mirrors the Russian flag while blending against snow and ice. The facility's 150 personnel, cycling through rotations lasting from several months to a year, occupy accommodations designed to minimize psychological strain from the endless Arctic night lasting October through February. Common areas feature windows designed to simulate natural daylight. Exercise facilities combat the boredom of confinement, and communications equipment allows video calls to families thousands of kilometers to the south. But Nagorskoye exists for purposes beyond crew comfort. The base hosts an upgraded SOPK-2 radar system capable of monitoring airspace across hundreds of kilometers, tracking aircraft transiting between Europe and North America via polar routes. MiG-31BM interceptors, specialized for Arctic operations with de-icing systems and navigation equipment calibrated for high-latitude magnetic anomalies, deploy there during exercises, demonstrating Russia's ability to scramble fighters even from this remote location. Pantsir S-1 air defense systems, combining anti-aircraft guns and surface-to-air missiles on a single tracked chassis, provide point defense against cruise missiles or aircraft attempting to strike the base. An ammunition depot carved into the permafrost stores weapons and supplies that would be impossible to resupply during winter months, when sea ice prevents ship access and Arctic storms ground transport aircraft for weeks at a stretch. Moving east across the Russian Arctic, Kotelny Island in the New Siberian Islands hosts another major installation. The Temp Air Base there underwent expansion beginning in 2014, with construction accelerating through 2016 and 17. Satellite imagery from that period reveals the methodical development of infrastructure designed for sustained military operations. Engineers poured reinforced concrete runways capable of handling heavy strategic bombers, erected fuel storage tanks holding thousands of tons of aviation kerosene, and constructed hardened shelters protecting aircraft from the elements and potential attack. The base received its own complement of air defense systems, S-400 batteries providing long-range protection, and Bastion P coastal defense missiles positioned to engage surface vessels transiting the Laptev Sea approaches to the Northern Sea route.
The S-400 deployment to Kotelny illustrates both the capability and limitations of Russia's Arctic air defense network. Each S-400 battery requires substantial supporting infrastructure that presents engineering challenges in permafrost environments. The system's Big Bird acquisition radar must be mounted on a foundation that remains stable despite seasonal ground movement as upper soil layers freeze and thaw. Power generation for the battery's extensive electronics demands reliable generators and fuel supplies sufficient to maintain operations during the long Arctic winter when resupply becomes impossible. Personnel operating the systems require heated shelters, not merely for comfort, but because human cognitive and physical performance degrades rapidly in extreme cold. The cost of maintaining a single S-400 battery at Kotelny far exceeds what the same unit would require on the Kola Peninsula or in western Russia, where infrastructure, supply lines, and qualified maintenance personnel are readily available.
Yet Russia accepts these costs because Kotelny's geographic position offers strategic value that cannot be replicated elsewhere. The island sits astride the Northern Sea route at a point where commercial vessels and potential military traffic must pass through the relatively narrow straits between the New Siberian Islands and the mainland. Air and naval forces operating from Kotelny can monitor and potentially interdict this traffic, establishing Russian control over a maritime passage that Moscow insists constitutes internal waters under national jurisdiction rather than an international strait subject to freedom of navigation. The SOPK-2 radar system deployed at Kotelny extends surveillance coverage across a region that would otherwise represent a blind spot between western Arctic installations and those further east in Chukotka. Wrangel Island, lying far to the east in the Chukchi Sea, just 300 kilometers from the coast of Alaska, received its own SOPK-2 installation as part of the broader radar modernization program. The island's position makes it strategically significant for monitoring aircraft approaching from North America and for surveilling the Bering Strait, the narrow passage through which all maritime traffic between the Pacific Ocean and Arctic Ocean must transit. American reconnaissance aircraft flying from Alaska toward Russian territory cross through airspace that Wrangel's radar can monitor, providing early warning of potential intrusions. Naval vessels, whether American, Chinese, or from other Pacific nations, transiting northward through the Bering Strait, come under observation from the moment they enter the Chukchi Sea.
Cape Schmidt on the Chukotka Peninsula, facing the East Siberian Sea, houses another SOPK-2 installation that complements the Wrangel Island radar. Together, these systems create overlapping coverage across the eastern approaches to the Northern Sea route. The coverage is not seamless. Radar horizons limit detection ranges for low-flying aircraft and small surface vessels, and the curvature of the Earth creates gaps that could only be filled by additional installations or airborne early warning aircraft. Nevertheless, the network provides Russia with surveillance capabilities across its Arctic periphery that dramatically exceed what existed during the lean post-Soviet decades. The radar systems, regardless of their sophistication, provide only awareness. Converting awareness into action requires forces capable of responding to detected threats, and here the dispersed nature of Arctic bases creates operational challenges. A radar operator at Cape Schmidt detecting an unidentified aircraft must relay that information to command centers that can order interceptors to scramble. But the nearest fighters capable of reaching the contact area might be hundreds of kilometers away at another base.
The response time, measured from initial detection to aircraft on station, could stretch to an hour or more, providing ample opportunity for the contact to complete its mission and depart. Russia attempts to mitigate this through forward deployment during periods of heightened tension, positioning fighters at forward bases like Wrangel Island or Kotelny, despite the substantial cost of maintaining aircraft and crews at locations with minimal supporting infrastructure.
The pattern of deployments visible across these Arctic installations suggests Russia prioritizes establishing presence over achieving optimal military capability at each location. Many bases host equipment and personnel sufficient for maintaining sovereignty and conducting limited defensive operations, but insufficient for sustained high-intensity combat. This approach reflects both resource constraints and strategic calculation. Fully garrisoning and equipping every Arctic base to wartime standards would consume budgets that Russia cannot afford, particularly given competing demands from operations elsewhere, modernization programs for strategic nuclear forces, and the need to maintain conventional forces facing NATO's eastern flank. Instead, Russia establishes the infrastructure, runways, port facilities, fuel storage, accommodations, communications that would allow rapid reinforcement if crisis emerged, while maintaining only small peacetime garrisons that keep the facilities operational and assert Russian presence.
The dual-use nature of many Arctic installations further complicates Western assessments of Russian military capabilities. A base described as supporting search and rescue operations genuinely performs that mission, responding to distressed aircraft or ships in one of the world's most unforgiving environments. The same facility, however, houses military personnel, maintains military equipment, and sits within a command structure ultimately controlled by the Ministry of Defense. During peacetime, its search and rescue helicopters assist civilian vessels navigating ice-choked waters. During crisis, the same helicopters could conduct reconnaissance or transport special operations forces to seize strategic locations. Fuel depots supporting commercial traffic along the Northern Sea Route also support military aircraft transiting between bases. Communications infrastructure linking remote weather stations into civilian meteorological networks also provides military forces with data essential for planning air and naval operations.
This dual-use strategy serves Russia's interests by reducing the apparent militarization of the Arctic while maintaining capabilities that could rapidly transition to military purposes. When Western analysts express concern about Russian military infrastructure in the Arctic, Moscow responds by highlighting the civilian functions these installations perform and questioning why NATO would object to search and rescue capabilities or navigational aids that benefit all nations using Arctic waters. Yet the integration of civilian and military functions makes it difficult to assess Russian capabilities based purely on observed peacetime activity. A base that appears lightly garrisoned during normal operations might host significantly more personnel and equipment during the brief summer construction season when supply ships can reach the facility, with that equipment then concealed in hardened shelters invisible to satellite observation. The Northern Sea Route itself has become both an economic aspiration and a military strategic asset in Russian planning. Extending from the Bering Strait in the east to the Kara Gate in the west, covering approximately 5,600 kilometers of Arctic coastline and adjacent waters, the route has become increasingly viable due to climate change. Russian government projections envision substantial increases in cargo tonnage transiting the route, generating revenue through transit fees and port charges while stimulating development of Arctic coastal regions.
The military implications of increased Northern Sea Route traffic concern Russian strategists who recognize that economic activity brings foreign vessels into waters Moscow considers vital to national security. Merchant ships from China, South Korea, Japan, and European nations transiting the route could theoretically conduct intelligence collection, mapping Arctic seafloor topology useful for submarine operations, monitoring Russian military activities along the coast, or even supporting special operations forces seeking to insert reconnaissance teams at remote locations.
Russia's response has been to tighten administrative control over the route while building infrastructure that supports both commercial navigation and military operations. In 2018, bureaucratic control over the Northern Sea route was transferred to Rosatom, Russia's state nuclear corporation. This seemingly odd assignment of a maritime route to a nuclear agency reflects Rosatom's control over Russia's fleet of nuclear icebreakers, vessels essential for maintaining year-round navigation along portions of the route. By consolidating authority in a single agency, Russia streamlined decision-making about route administration, icebreaker deployment, and infrastructure investment. The arrangement also allows tighter integration between civilian and military activities, as Rosatom coordinates with the Ministry of Defense on issues ranging from icebreaker support for naval operations to construction of dual-use port facilities.
Recent regulatory changes require foreign warships to provide 45 days advance notice before transiting the Northern Sea route and to receive explicit Russian government permission. Russia justifies this requirement by classifying the route as internal waters, subject to Russian jurisdiction, rather than as an international strait where foreign vessels enjoy right of innocent passage. Most Western nations reject this characterization, arguing that straits used for international navigation cannot be closed to foreign vessels under customary international law. The dispute remains unresolved, and in practice, Western naval forces have avoided directly challenging Russian control by conducting freedom of navigation operations in waters Russia claims, focusing instead on building surveillance capabilities and maintaining presence in the Norwegian and Barents Seas, where legal status is less ambiguous. The icebreaker fleet supporting Northern Sea route operations represents a unique Russian strategic asset without parallel among Arctic nations. With 42 icebreakers, including 8 nuclear-powered vessels, Russia possesses far more capability than any other country for operating in heavy ice conditions. The Project 22,220 nuclear icebreakers, Arktika, Sibir, Ural, and additional vessels under construction are the most powerful icebreakers ever built, capable of breaking through ice several meters thick while maintaining continuous operations for months without refueling. Their nuclear reactors, derived from naval propulsion plants, give them unlimited range and the ability to support other vessels in regions where conventional icebreakers would need to periodically return to port for fuel.
More intriguing from a military perspective are the Project 23,550 armed icebreakers like Ivan Papanin. These vessels blur the distinction between support ships and combatants, combining the reinforced hull and powerful engines necessary for icebreaking with containerized missile systems, artillery, and facilities for operating helicopters. In peacetime, they provide patrol and law enforcement capability in ice-covered waters where conventional warships cannot operate. During heightened tensions or conflict, the same vessels could conduct combat operations, using their missiles to engage hostile aircraft or ships, while their ice-breaking capability ensures mobility in conditions that trap conventional vessels. The concept of armed icebreakers as capital ships represents uniquely Arctic thinking, recognizing that platforms optimized for blue water combat become ineffective when ice restricts their maneuverability. Russian icebreakers regularly support military operations, clearing channels for submarines surfacing through ice, escorting supply vessels to remote bases during brief navigation windows, and conducting search and rescue operations when military exercises go wrong. During major Northern Fleet exercises in the Arctic, icebreakers position themselves along planned transit routes, ensuring that surface combatants can move through areas where ice conditions might otherwise block passage. This integration of icebreakers into military planning reflects decades of experience operating in ice-covered waters, where environmental factors pose greater immediate risks than enemy action.
The dispersed network of bases, radar installations, air defense systems, and supporting infrastructure creates a picture of Russian capability that must be assessed not by examining individual installations in isolation, but by considering how they function as an integrated system.
A merchant vessel transiting the northern sea route comes under observation from multiple radar installations as it proceeds eastward. Its progress tracked by communication systems linking remote stations to fleet headquarters at Severomorsk and to Rosatom offices managing route administration. If Russian authorities determine the vessel poses a security concern, perhaps it deviates from its approved route, or intelligence suggests it is conducting reconnaissance rather than simple commercial transit, forces positioned at installations along the route can respond. Bastion P batteries deployed at Novaya Zemlya, Kotelny, or other locations provide anti-ship capability across approaches to the route. Fighters deploying to forward bases can intercept aircraft supporting the vessel's navigation or conducting reconnaissance themselves. Submarines operating in the area can trail the vessel, monitoring its activities and prepared to interdict if ordered. Russia's Liana maritime reconnaissance satellite constellation theoretically provides space-based targeting support for these operations. Yet as of the early 2020s, Liana consisted of only 3 signals intelligence satellites, with its crucial radar reconnaissance satellites still awaiting launch. This limitation means Russia cannot maintain continuous space-based surveillance of Arctic waters, creating windows when vessels might transit undetected or when targeting data for long-range missile strikes remains unavailable. The gap between theoretical capability suggested by deployed systems and practical effectiveness constrained by incomplete supporting infrastructure appears repeatedly across Russia's Arctic military posture. Both perspectives contain elements of truth. Russia has clearly established military infrastructure across its Arctic territories on a scale that would have seemed impossible during the 1990s. This infrastructure enhances Russia's ability to monitor and control access to waters Moscow considers vital to national security, particularly the approaches to the Barents Sea bastion where ballistic missile submarines operate. At the same time, the network remains incomplete, with sensor coverage gaps, insufficient numbers of rapid response forces positioned to exploit early warning, and sustainability questions about how long Russia could maintain these forces if supply lines were interdicted. The military value of the infrastructure may lie less in its ability to defeat a determined Western military operation than in its capacity to impose costs, create uncertainty, and complicate planning for any operation that requires access to Russian Arctic waters. How these various capabilities, the bases, radars, missiles, and icebreakers, combine with the broader strategic systems Russia has deployed across its military forces, raises questions about whether Moscow has created a genuine anti-access capability that could deny NATO freedom of action across substantial portions of the Arctic and North Atlantic, or whether Russian planners have simply rebuilt infrastructure sufficient to monitor their periphery and defend their most critical military assets without seriously contesting Western maritime superiority in the region. Chapter 4. The Tyranny of Range. The phrase anti-access area denial, compressed into the military acronym A2AD, achieved near ubiquity in Western defense circles during the 2010s. Strategic documents, congressional testimony, and think tank reports invoked the term to describe what appeared to be a new and dangerous reality: long-range missile systems deployed by Russia and China that could theoretically threaten vast geographic areas, potentially denying the United States and its allies freedom of maneuver they had enjoyed since the Cold War's end. Defense contractors seized upon A2AD anxieties to market countermeasures, while military services justified budget requests by citing the need to defeat enemy anti-access strategies. Yet beneath this consensus that A2AD represented a fundamental challenge lurked significant disagreement about what the term actually meant, whether it accurately described Russian military strategy, and whether Western analysts had fundamentally misunderstood what Russia was attempting to achieve. Concentric circles and strategic confusion. Maps began circulating in defense publications showing concentric circles radiating from Russian bases, with each circle representing the theoretical maximum range of different weapon systems. A Bastion B battery positioned in Kaliningrad appeared capable of engaging ships across most of the Baltic Sea. Analysts wrote with evident concern that these overlapping rings of missile coverage could block naval activity across entire regions, with claims that coastal defense systems in Crimea might even threaten the Bosporus, according to statements attributed to senior Russian military officers.
These assessments shared a common assumption that weapons range equals effective coverage, and that effective coverage at multiple locations creates zones from which adversaries can be excluded. The logic appeared straightforward. If a missile can fly 300 kilometers, then any target within 300 kilometers of that missile's launcher is at risk, and prudent military planners should avoid operating within that threatened area. Aggregate multiple such systems across a theater, and the threatened zones merge into continuous bubbles from which Western forces might be excluded entirely. This geometric approach to assessing military capability proved seductive in its simplicity and alarming in its implications. Kaufman's critique. In September 2019, Michael Kaufman, a respected analyst of Russian military affairs, published a pointed critique arguing that Western defense establishments had inappropriately extended a concept developed to describe Chinese strategy in the Western Pacific to Russian operations in Eastern Europe and the Arctic. The term A2AD emerged from American attempts to understand how China might use land-based missiles, submarines, and aircraft to prevent American carrier strike groups from operating near the Chinese coast during a conflict over Taiwan.
Applying this same framework to Russia, Kaufman argued, reflected lazy analysis that assumed similar technologies would necessarily be employed identically regardless of geography, adversary, or strategic context. Russian military planners confronted entirely different challenges than their Chinese counterparts. Where China worried about American carriers approaching from deep-water ocean areas, Russia faced potential threats from NATO forces already positioned along its borders. Where China could concentrate forces in a relatively compact theater around Taiwan, Russia had to defend approaches to the Kola Peninsula, the Baltic Sea, the Black Sea, and the Pacific coast simultaneously. Most tellingly, the Russian military itself had no indigenous term equivalent to A2AD, instead using English transliterations when discussing Western analyses of Russian capabilities. This absence of native terminology suggested that Western analysts had imposed a conceptual framework that might not align with how Russian planners actually thought about their defensive requirements.
Kaufman's critique extended beyond semantics to fundamental questions about Russian military strategy. Western A2A analysis implied that Russia sought to maximize the geographic coverage of its long-range weapons, creating overlapping defensive bubbles that would seal off large swaths of ocean and airspace. Russian doctrine, Kaufman argued, revealed no such ambition. Instead, Russian military planners concentrated defensive systems around specific critical areas, primarily the approaches to the Barents Sea where ballistic missile submarines operated, while accepting that other regions could not be defended with equal intensity. The long-range capabilities of systems like Bastion P provided flexibility to support operations selectively, shaping adversary behavior and imposing costs at chosen points. But Russian planners harbored no illusions that these systems formed impermeable barriers capable of surviving sustained Western attack. The sensor problem. The distinction between theoretical range and practical effectiveness becomes stark when examining Russia's targeting capabilities. Long-range missiles require precise current information about target location, course, and speed. Ships move, and they move unpredictably when operating in combat conditions with electronic warfare actively disrupting communications and navigation systems. A target 200 kilometers from a Bastion launcher might travel 10 or 20 kilometers in the time required for the missile to reach that area. And enemy vessels, aware they are under attack, will take evasive action, launch countermeasures, and maneuver to spoil targeting solutions.
Russia attempts to solve this targeting problem through networked sensors, combining ground-based radars, maritime patrol aircraft, helicopters, satellites, and potentially surface vessels or submarines. The Monolith B over-the-horizon radar system, designed to support Bastion batteries, can detect surface vessels at ranges between 90 and 155 miles, extending to 280 miles against ships actively emitting radar signals, making them cooperative targets. Against vessels maintaining electronic silence or employing deception techniques, effective range drops substantially. Maritime patrol aircraft can search vast ocean areas and relay targeting data to coastal batteries, but these aircraft themselves become targets for enemy fighters or surface-to-air missiles when operating over contested waters. Russia operates several large over-the-horizon radars, including the Podzolnukh-E and container systems, that might theoretically contribute to maritime targeting. These massive installations can detect large surface vessels at ranges exceeding the horizon, but they face fundamental limitations. Over-the-horizon radars achieve their extended range by bouncing signals off the ionosphere, a technique that provides general target location but insufficient precision for missile targeting. The radars also suffer from atmospheric interference, cannot track low-altitude targets reliably, and require substantial supporting infrastructure that makes them vulnerable to attack. More critically, these over-the-horizon radars are not integrated into Bastion battery command structures, meaning that even when they detect contacts, that information must be manually relayed through command channels that introduce delays incompatible with engaging time-sensitive targets. Kaufman's analysis emphasized these sensor limitations, noting that Russian ISR capabilities make A2AD rather dodgy beyond tactical operational ranges. He characterized coastal defense missile systems like Bastion and Bal as constituting the final line of defense in Russian maritime strategy, not the primary means of sea control, somewhere between Plan C or Plan D, rather than the primary method for contesting naval operations. Russian naval warfare depends first on maritime strike aviation capable of ranging far beyond coastal defenses while updating targeting solutions in real time. Second in importance come submarines that can trail enemy task forces and strike with torpedoes or missiles at close range where targeting uncertainties become manageable. Third, naval mines deployed in choke points create hazards that force enemy vessels into predictable channels. Only after aviation, submarines, and mines do coastal defense systems enter the equation, positioned to exploit opportunities when enemy vessels venture within range and when sufficient targeting data happens to be available. Geography and operational reality. Geography further complicates Russian sea denial efforts in ways that theoretical range rings obscure. The Norwegian Sea, where NATO reinforcement convoys might transit from North America toward Northern Europe, averages 1,800 meters in depth. This deep water provides excellent operating conditions for Western submarines equipped with sophisticated sonar systems and weapons. Russian anti-submarine forces would face the daunting challenge of searching enormous volumes of ocean where submarines can hide beneath thermal layers and acoustic shadows. In contrast, the Barents Sea, with its average depth of 230 meters, offers less favorable conditions for submarine operations, but can be more effectively monitored by Russian forces operating from nearby bases with detailed knowledge of local acoustic conditions. Russian strategy acknowledges these geographic realities by concentrating anti-submarine forces in the Barents Sea, where environmental factors favor defense, while accepting that controlling the Norwegian Sea would require capabilities Russia simply does not possess. Survivability and cost imposition. The operational challenges multiply when considering the survivability of Russian systems under sustained attack. A Bastion battery consists of multiple vehicles, 4 launcher trucks, 4 reload vehicles, a command vehicle, and often a separate radar vehicle, all of which must be positioned relatively close together to function effectively. Though mobile, these vehicles leave signatures detectable by modern intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance systems. Infrared sensors can detect heat from vehicle engines. Synthetic aperture radar satellites can track movements across barren Arctic terrain. Communications intercepts reveal when batteries receive targeting data or transmit status reports. Despite Russian exercises demonstrating 5-minute deployment times from stowed to firing position, peacetime drills occur in controlled conditions without enemy interference. Combat would feature pervasive electronic warfare degrading communications between battery elements, potential cyber attacks against command and control systems, and physical attacks against radars and logistics facilities supporting the batteries. Western militaries train extensively in suppression of enemy air defenses, operating on the assumption that Russian systems, while capable, can be defeated through combinations of stealth, electronic attack, decoys, and direct strikes.
Russian military planners understand these vulnerabilities, which explains their apparent strategy of using systems like Bastion not to permanently deny areas, but to impose costs and create dilemmas that shape adversary operations. A NATO task force planning to transit through waters covered by Bastion batteries must allocate resources to locating and suppressing those batteries before surface vessels can proceed safely. Suppression operations consume time, expend munitions, expose aircraft to Russian air defenses, and require intelligence preparation that telegraphs intentions. Even if NATO forces successfully neutralize the batteries, a likely outcome given Western conventional superiority, the delay and resource expenditure benefits Russian strategy by slowing NATO's operational tempo and consuming assets that might otherwise be employed elsewhere. This cost imposition strategy works only if Russian forces can maintain ambiguity about the location and status of their mobile systems. Russia, therefore, invests in camouflage, concealment, deception operations designed to generate false targets and rapid displacement drills that minimize the time batteries remain stationary. Whether these peacetime measures would function effectively under combat conditions remains uncertain. The deterrence calculation.
The debate about Russian A2A effectiveness often hinges on unstated assumptions about the level of effort the West would commit to defeating Russian defenses. Live harassment by individual reconnaissance aircraft or small patrol vessels would likely be deterred by the threat of Russian retaliation. Full-scale NATO operations employing stealth bombers, carrier aviation, submarine-launched cruise missiles, and cyber warfare in integrated campaigns would almost certainly overwhelm Russian defensive systems over time. The question becomes not whether NATO could defeat Russian A2A, but at what cost and over what time frame. Russian strategy appears premised on making the cost high enough and the timeline long enough that NATO might hesitate to undertake operations in the first place. If attacking Russian defensive systems requires committing scarce stealth bombers and expending expensive cruise missiles while accepting aircraft losses to air defenses, NATO political leaders might conclude that certain objectives do not justify those costs. This deterrence by cost imposition differs fundamentally from the impermeable area denial that early A2A analysis suggested, but it may prove equally effective at shaping Western behavior during crises short of total war. The limitation of this approach becomes apparent when considering scenarios where Western political will proves stronger than Russian planners anticipated. Once NATO commits to an operation and accepts the costs, Russian systems designed to impose expense rather than achieve decisive operational effects cannot prevent their own destruction. The elaborate infrastructure built across the Russian Arctic would likely survive only briefly against sustained Western attack, representing less a capability to permanently deny access than a bargaining chip designed to give Russia leverage in negotiations. Yet the theoretical debate over Russian A2AD capabilities would soon face an unexpected test, as Russia's invasion of Ukraine provided concrete evidence about how advanced defensive systems perform under combat conditions and how strategic calculations shift when conflict transforms from abstract possibility into brutal reality. Chapter 5. Then the signaling stopped. February 24, 2022, marks a decisive inflection point not just for Ukraine, but for Russian military posture across its entire periphery. When Russian forces crossed the border that morning, launching the largest European land war since 1945, the Kremlin set in motion consequences that would ripple far beyond Ukrainian territory. In the Arctic waters, thousands of kilometers north of the fighting, Russian naval activity underwent a transformation so abrupt and so complete that Western intelligence analysts tracking routine notice-to-airmen messages detected the shift within months of the invasion's start. The strategic backdrop to this transformation had been building for years. In December 2021, just weeks before the invasion, Admiral Alexander Moiseyev, then Deputy Commander of the Navy, stated that the Arctic is one of the key regions where the confrontation of the world's leading states is unfolding, and warned of foreign militaries expanding their Arctic presence. His assessment proved prescient, though not in the way Russian planners likely anticipated.
For 7 years preceding the invasion, Russian military forces had conducted a pattern of exercises and live fire drills in international waters and airspace along NATO's northern flank that followed a distinct logic. Russian vessels and aircraft ventured south into the Norwegian Sea, well beyond the areas required for defending the Barents Sea bastion, and often well south of the Arctic Circle itself. These deployments frequently occurred in close temporal and geographic proximity to NATO exercises or American naval presence in the region. When U.S. carrier strike groups transited through Norwegian waters, Russian bombers appeared shortly thereafter. When NATO convened its massive Trident Juncture exercise in Norway during October 2018, Russian reconnaissance aircraft conducted repeated penetration attempts toward the exercise area. The geographic focus carried particular significance. Norwegian sea waters extend southward well below the Arctic Circle into areas where sea control provides no direct military benefit to protecting Russian ballistic missile submarines. A Bastion P battery conducting firing exercises 600 kilometers southwest of the Kola Peninsula threatens Norwegian coastal cities more than it secures the inner bastion. The incongruence between location and defensive requirements suggested purposes beyond pure military training.
Researchers at Norway's defense establishment, tracking Russian notice-to-airmen messages, documented this pattern with precision. Between 2015 and 2022, Russian NOTAM events showed consistent presence in the Norwegian Sea, often announced with minimal advance notice and scheduled to overlap with periods when Western forces were actively operating in the region. The researchers characterized this behavior as acts of politically motivated and coercive signaling towards neighboring states and foreign audiences. Then the signaling stopped. Analysis of Russian NOTAM data from the months following February 2022 reveals a dramatic geographic shift. Almost all Russian NOTAM events now occur in the Barents Sea rather than the Norwegian Sea. The exercises that continue take place in waters adjacent to the Kola Peninsula, focused on the approaches to the inner bastion where ballistic missile submarines patrol rather than in the more distant waters where previous activity suggested political messaging.
The transformation appears in both location and character of Russian naval operations. When Russia announced its July Storm exercise in late July 2025, describing it as involving 150 warships, 120 aircraft, 10 coastal missile batteries, and around 15,000 personnel across multiple theaters, the Northern Fleet component remained contained within the Barents Sea. Bastion P units deployed to firing positions along the Barents coast, not to locations from which they might signal to NATO forces in the Norwegian Sea. The frigate Admiral Golovko and cruiser Marshal Ustinov departed Kola Bay for the Barents Sea proper, conducting exercises within waters Russia must control to maintain the bastion rather than venturing into contested areas beyond. Yet this pattern shift appears theater-specific rather than universal. In October 2025, Russia's Baltic Fleet conducted a Bastion P exercise on the shores of the Gulf of Finland, simulating strikes against naval groups and remote command posts. The location near newly joined NATO members Finland and Sweden suggested continued signaling capability in European theaters even as Arctic operations became purely defensive. This complicates the narrative. The shift represents not a wholesale abandonment of coercive signaling as a tool, but rather a strategic retreat in the Arctic specifically, where Russian priorities and capabilities had changed most dramatically.
When Russia deployed Bastion P systems to the Kuril island of Paramushir in December 2022, part of the broader infrastructure expansion discussed in Chapter 3, the timing suggested defensive priorities trumping diplomatic considerations. Tokyo had expressed regret over earlier Bastion P deployments to disputed southern Kuril islands. Moscow proceeded regardless, with the Russian Defense Ministry stating that Pacific Fleet missile units would maintain round-the-clock standby to control the adjacent water area and strait zones. 4 hypotheses, not mutually exclusive, might explain the Arctic pattern change. The first suggests that Russian strategists concluded their Norwegian Sea signaling efforts had proven futile. For 7 years, Moscow had dispatched vessels and aircraft to international waters adjacent to NATO territory, demonstrating capability and resolve through exercises that consumed fuel, flight hours, and maintenance capacity. These deployments achieved visibility, but did not achieve their presumed strategic objectives. They did not deter NATO expansion, did not prevent alliance exercises, and did not persuade Western governments to accommodate Russian demands about European security architecture.
The futility ran deeper. Russian signaling exercises arguably strengthened alliance resolve by providing regular reminders of the Russian threat, reinforcing arguments for increased military budgets and expanded NATO presence. When Finland and Sweden applied for NATO membership in May 2022, responding directly to the Russian invasion, it became undeniable that Russian military signaling had failed to prevent the very outcome Moscow most feared. Finland's 1,300-kilometer border with Russia fundamentally transformed the strategic picture, essentially making the Baltic a NATO lake and dramatically increasing pressure on Russian Arctic positions. Faced with this counterproductive dynamic, Russian planners might reasonably have concluded that continuing to expend resources on signaling exercises delivered diminishing returns. The second hypothesis addresses civilian and foreign government pushback that raised political costs. Russian NOTAM events that closed large areas of international waters disrupted civilian aviation and maritime traffic, generating complaints from airlines, shipping companies, and coastal states. Norwegian fishermen protested disruptions, while aviation authorities expressed safety concerns. Though not forcing Russia to cease exercises, these complaints created friction with constituencies whose cooperation Moscow needed for other purposes, particularly maintaining navigable corridors for commercial shipping along the Northern Sea route. Foreign government protests escalated after incidents where Russian exercises appeared deliberately timed to disrupt NATO activities, contributing to broader deterioration in relations that pushed Sweden toward NATO membership.
The third hypothesis addresses the most tangible change. Russian conventional military capacity declined dramatically due to losses in Ukraine. Northern Fleet coastal forces were either redeployed to support operations or had their manning and equipment drawn down to provide replacements for decimated southern formations. The sinking of the flagship cruiser Moskva in April 2022, while not directly affecting Northern Fleet operations, influenced risk calculations throughout the service. More significantly, the war consumed equipment and munitions at rates exceeding pre-war production capacity. Precision-guided weapon stocks, including the very missiles that Bastion P systems fire, were expended in strikes across Ukraine. Bastion P systems in Crimea launched Onyx missiles against Ukrainian targets, drawing down inventories that could not be rapidly replenished. Crew casualties and equipment wear further constrained capacity, with vessels remaining pierside awaiting maintenance that shipyards lacked capacity to complete or serving as spare parts sources. Western sanctions restricted access to components essential for maintaining advanced systems, forcing commanders to prioritize keeping equipment operational for core missions rather than consuming remaining service life on peripheral activities. The fourth hypothesis suggests Russia's strategic emphasis shifted decisively toward nuclear deterrence following the invasion's failure to achieve quick victory. Initial Russian war plans apparently anticipated swift collapse of Ukrainian resistance.
When Ukrainian forces instead held the capital and Western military assistance began flowing in quantities that sustained prolonged resistance, Russian strategic calculations had to adjust radically. Nuclear saber-rattling became a regular feature of Russian rhetoric, with Putin and other officials repeatedly referencing Russia's nuclear arsenal. This nuclear emphasis reflected both deterrent signaling toward NATO and genuine Russian concern about conventional military weakness potentially inviting Western aggression that could only be deterred through nuclear threats. Protecting the submarines that constituted Russia's most survivable nuclear capability acquired renewed urgency when conventional forces demonstrated brittleness during the Ukraine fighting. The prioritization of nuclear deterrence naturally shifted resources toward the Barents Sea bastion where ballistic missile submarines operated, pulling focus away from activities in the Norwegian Sea that contributed little to protecting those strategic assets. If Russian planners assessed that NATO-Russia conflict probability had increased, then training forces in the specific operational environments where they would fight became more important than conducting signaling exercises in peripheral areas.
These hypotheses converge on a common conclusion. Russia's post-invasion military posture in the high north represents a shift from offensive signaling intended to shape Western behavior toward defensive preparation for maintaining the bastion's integrity against a strengthened NATO now directly adjacent to the Barents Sea. The admission implicit in this shift carries profound significance. Russia is acknowledging, through its actions if not its rhetoric, that it cannot simultaneously conduct far-forward signaling operations and maintain credible defense of its core strategic assets. Yet the persistence of signaling exercises in the Baltic, even as Arctic operations contracted, suggests the shift reflects less a fundamental change in Russian strategic thinking than a forced adaptation to changed circumstances in a specific theater. Russia maintains coercive signaling as a tool where it retains capacity, abandoning it only where the combination of alliance expansion, conventional military degradation, and acute defensive requirements has made continuing such operations untenable. The Arctic represented Russian planners' margin for error, narrowing to the point that consolidation trumped demonstration. Whether similar contractions might occur in other theaters depends on how those same pressures, Western military buildup, Russian resource constraints, and the irreducible requirement to protect nuclear deterrent forces evolve in the Black Sea, the Pacific, and along the Baltic approaches where NATO membership now extends to Russia's doorstep.
Russia's Bastion defense reveals a strategy born from geographic constraint and nuclear imperative. What began as a Cold War solution to submarine vulnerability has evolved into a vast Arctic infrastructure network, though its effectiveness remains contested. The A2AD debate exposed gaps between theoretical weapons ranges and practical targeting capabilities. While Russia's retreat from Norwegian Sea signaling after the Ukraine invasion demonstrates how strategic ambitions contract under resource pressure. Today's Bastion is simultaneously more fortified, yet more constrained than ever before. Expanded infrastructure protecting fewer operational assets, defending against an alliance now positioned directly along its borders. The Arctic's transformation from frozen barrier to accessible waterway compounds this paradox, opening commercial opportunities while eroding defensive advantages. Whether Russia's concentrated defense of its nuclear deterrent represents pragmatic adaptation or strategic weakness depends on a question that may only be answered in crisis. Can infrastructure substitute for the capacity to project power beyond one's own waters? Thank you for listening.